In the summer of 1889, when the Cimarron River fell so low, a man could wade it without wetting his belt, a stretch of bottomland that had spent 3 years underwater finally gave itself back to the sky. What it left on the surface, caked in river clay and tilted at the angle of something long submerged, was a chest of rolled iron no larger than a steamer trunk, its lid sealed with a mechanism no ordinary key could open. The land it sat on belonged to a 26-year-old woman named Vera Cass, who had purchased it the previous autumn for $1 at the Woodward County tax lien sale, paying with the last silver coin she owned to a county clerk who had barely looked at her. The clerk had not told her. The property flooded. The men standing behind her at the sale had laughed when she signed the transfer, and one of them had said, loud enough to carry, that she had bought herself a mudhole and nothing else. Vera had folded her copy of the deed without looking at any of them and walked out into the October wind. She had not expected the river to give her anything. She had bought the claim because she could read a survey plat, and what she had read in the Woodward County records room told her the bottomland sat on a bench of the Cimarron Formation that had produced placer color in 1881, before a company out of Wichita had quietly consolidated the surrounding parcels and let the flooded claim lapse for unpaid taxes rather than disclose the bench's value to a territorial assessor. She did not know what the chest was. She had not known the chest existed. She knew only that the ground beneath the flood line had once been worth something, and that the company's decision to let it drown rather than acknowledge it suggested the worth had not disappeared. If you have ever watched a river leave a thing behind, leave it somewhere between you and what you thought you understood, stay with this story. It has something to say. Vera Cass had learned to read survey instruments from her father, a man named Horace, who had worked the land offices of 2 territories before a fever took him in the spring of 1885. He had taught her the vernier scale on a transit, the difference between a magnetic and true meridian, the patience required to triangulate a claim from 3 fixed monuments when the original stakes had rotted away. He had taught her to read the land the way a doctor reads a patient, with the eyes first, then the hands, and the instruments last of all, because the instruments only confirmed what careful attention had already suggested. He had taught her these things because he had no sons, and because, as he said on more than one morning, while she held the rod and he squinted through the eyepiece, a woman who could read the land had something no landlord could take from her. He had also taught her to be suspicious of the records, not dishonest with them, but suspicious, the way a careful reader is suspicious of a document that tells a clean story without visible seams. Conveyance ledgers had gaps. Tax records had gaps. The gaps, he said, were where the money was hiding. He meant this practically, not cynically. A piece of land that appeared in a deed record and then disappeared for a decade, surfacing again at a fraction of its earlier assessed value, was almost always a piece of land someone had wanted to make invisible. The invisibility was itself information. Horace had died leaving her the transit in its leather case, a satchel of plat maps for the Northwestern Territories, the key on its cord, and $17, which she had stretched across 4 years of room rent and plain meals while she found work wherever a county surveyor would accept a female assistant. The work was intermittent. There were surveyors who would not employ her at any price, and others who employed her quietly and paid her at 3/4 the rate they paid the men. She had taken every engagement offered, in Kansas, in the Colorado Territories, twice in the Indian Territory before it organized into Oklahoma. She had learned across those 4 years to file what she felt about the rate in the same place her father had taught her, to file the deviation between a compass bearing and a true one, noted, corrected for, and not complained about, aloud. What the work gave her, beyond the intermittent wages, was access to the records, rooms. Every county had one. Every one contained the accumulated paper of transactions that the people who made them had assumed were finished. Vera had spent 4 years reading finished transactions and noting where they were not as finished as they appeared. She had not yet found a situation in which the reading led somewhere she could act. She had kept reading anyway. The $1 purchase had not been impulsive. She had spent 6 weeks in the Woodward County Records Room before the October lien sale, working through the conveyance ledgers in sequence, cross-referencing partial numbers against the original survey plats her father's satchel contained. The county clerk, a young man named Presley, who wore paper cuffs to protect his shirt, had watched her work on the first 2 mornings with visible confusion, and on the 3rd morning with the settled resignation of someone who had decided she was harmless enough and would likely leave soon. She did not leave soon. She was there each day when he unlocked the room, and still there most evenings when he came back to lock it again. He stopped watching her. After the first week, what she was assembling from the deeds and tax assessments and lien records was a map of a decision. The Wichita Company, a land and irrigation concern called the Cimarron Basin Development Association, had assembled 11 parcels along a 4-mile reach of the river between 1882 and 1884, paying prices that ranged from $40 an acre to $300 depending on how well a seller understood what he owned. The prices varied in a pattern that interested her. The highest prices had been paid for the parcels farthest from the river's center channel, the upland portions with proven soil and established water rights. The lowest prices had been paid for the parcels closest to the main current, the bottomland prone to flooding, the ground most ordinary buyers would have valued least. Parcel 7 was the lowest priced of the 11. Which meant the association had wanted it enough to acquire it through a structure that obscured that wanting. They had held a mortgage note on it instead of purchasing it outright, extended through a Woodward banker named Holt, and when the bottomland went underwater in the spring of 1886, they had allowed the tax payments to lapse and Holt to foreclose quietly, expecting the parcel to be absorbed into the county's delinquent tax roll and sold for nothing to no one who would know its value. The gap the parcel had made in the association's holdings was the gap her father had taught her to look for. 10 contiguous parcels and 1 hole. The hole was always worth asking about. She had asked, quietly. Through the records, the answer came back in the form of an absence. There was no geological or engineering report in the Woodward County file on any of the 11 parcels. The association had commissioned none, or had commissioned one and kept it out of the county record. Either way, the absence of a report for a land company that had paid between $40 and $300 an acre along a river bottomland was itself a fact, and the fact said that whatever they knew about the ground they had not wanted anyone else knowing. What they had not expected was a 26-year-old woman with a transit and a dead man's satchel standing at the county clerk's counter in October 1889, paying $1 for the deed while a room full of men laughed. Presley had looked at her when he took her dollar. Just once. And briefly. She had not been able to read what was in the look. It was possible he felt sorry for her. It was possible he was simply noting her as an entry in the day's transactions. She had folded the deed and walked out into the October wind, and did not think about the look again. She had traveled from Woodward to the claim on foot mostly, with a hired wagon for the 3 miles of track too rough to carry the transit safely on her back. The distance was 11 miles from the county seat, and she covered it in 2 days, camping the first night on the open tableland above the river, building no fire because there was no wood. She ate dried biscuit and looked at the sky, which was the deep, clear black of a drought sky in August, and counted the stars she recognized by name from a book her father had given her that was not a surveying book, but a navigation almanac, because he said the stars were the first survey. She arrived at the flood bench in the late morning of the second day, coming down the shallow cut in the terrace wall to the bottomland below. The bench was wide here, 30 yards or more between the terrace face and the river's present edge, and the surface of it was a mosaic of cracked clay, gray-white at the surface where the August sun had bleached it, and darker below where moisture still held. In places, the surface had cracked into polygons the width of her palm, and in others, it had buckled slightly, where something below the surface had expanded during wetting and not fully settled back. She noted the buckled places. They told her the subsoil was not uniform. She made camp on the claim that evening, setting her bedroll on the cracked mud of the flood bench, the transit case beside her, and the deed folded in the breast pocket of her coat. The river was still low, running clear and thin over the gravel bars, its channel 20 yards from where the chest lay. She had not approached the chest yet. She had walked the bench first, all of it, in a systematic traverse, reading it as her father had taught her to read a piece of ground, before touching anything, the lay of the surface, the depression lines where water had stood longest, the places where the clay had cracked first and deepest, which told her where the bench stood highest. She noted 3 places where the alluvial material had stratified visibly at the surface. The characteristic banded sediment of a placer bench, oxidized iron giving the upper layer the color of old brick. She noted the bearing of the bench's long axis and paced its extent. She recorded these observations in her field notebook with the same precision she brought to a commissioned survey, because the land did not care whether she was being paid to look at it. The chest lay in a shallow dish of the bench, a low point, which meant the river had not deposited it there in the most recent flood season. The river had uncovered it. It had already been there, buried above the flood-time waterline, placed by someone who expected the river to conceal it, and had not reckoned on a drought that would strip the concealment away. She stood at the edge of the dish and looked at the chest for a long time before she walked down into it. The next morning she brought her pry bar and her mallet from the pack, and approached the chest in the full light of 7 o'clock. It was riveted iron, the seams swaged and sealed in a manner she associated with strong-room construction, rather than ordinary freight. The lid was held by a hasp mechanism she did not immediately recognize. Not a padlock receiver, not a simple bolt latch, but a recessed plate of iron with a keyhole of unusual profile, wide at the base and narrowing at the top in an inverted taper she had seen once before. She had seen it in her father's survey kit, on the instrument case he had purchased from a retired Army Corps engineer in Dodge City in 1882. The engineer had told Horace that the lock was a sergeant pattern, a levered tumbler design used by the Army Quartermaster's Department in the late 1872 for payroll strongboxes issued to remote outposts. The design's distinguishing feature was the keyhole's inverted taper, which accepted only the correct blank profile and could not be picked by inserting a standard skeleton key or a shim. Horace had never needed to open the instrument case with anything but the original key, which had come with it and which he had passed to Vera along with everything else he owned. She wore it on a cord at her neck. She had worn it there for 4 years, through every survey engagement, through every county records room, through the October lien sale and the walk back to her rented room. She had kept it because it was his, and because he had told her never to discard a key until she was certain she knew every lock it had been made to open. She crouched and looked at the keyhole more closely. The profile was a match. Not a close match, an exact match. The dimensions of the keyhole aperture, the width of the inverted taper, the gauge of the opening, These were the same in every particular as the lock on her father's instrument case, which meant both had been manufactured to the same Army quartermaster specification by the same contractor during the same production run. The chest had not been placed on this land by accident. It had been placed here by someone with access to a quartermaster strongbox, someone who had known the bench existed and known its value, and had needed a place to seal that knowledge away from the people who were using it against its rightful owner. She lifted the cord over her head and stood in front of the chest for a long moment, the key in her palm, the river running quietly behind her. She was not a woman given to ceremony. She did not speak aloud to her father or ask any question of the sky. She simply looked at what was in front of her, the way he had taught her to look at a piece of ground, with full attention and without haste. And then she knelt in the dried clay and fitted the key to the lock. The mechanism had been submerged for 3 years. She expected resistance, and she found it. The lever tumblers gummed with silt, the key requiring more pressure than it should have to seat fully. She worked it in careful quarter turns, applying oil from the small can in her coat pocket, easing the key back and pressing again, not forcing it, never forcing it, the way her father had taught her to treat a seized instrument. Patience and oil and the understanding that the part was not broken, only reluctant. On the second quarter turn, the key seated a fraction further. On the third, she felt the first tumbler align, a faint vibration through the key's bow, barely perceptible, but there. On the fourth quarter turn, the remaining tumblers released with a sound like a bell struck underwater, muffled and final, and the hasp fell open. She sat back on her heels. The river ran. A meadowlark called from the far bank and fell silent. She lifted the lid. The air that came out was the air of 1885, cold and faintly metallic, and carrying the particular closeness of a sealed space. She held herself still for a moment in the wave of it, the smell of old oilcloth and sealed iron and something. Beneath those, a mineral dryness that was the smell of a document preserved. The interior was lined with oilcloth, blackened at the edges where river water had seeped around the lid's gasket during the 3 years of flooding, but intact. At the center oilcloth, as supple and dark as the day it had been laid in. Under the oilcloth, nested in channels of oil-soaked wool batting, were 4 things. A brass-fitted surveyor's field book with a waterproof canvas cover, the brass fittings green patinated but not corroded through. A roll of cartographic linen tied with wax string, the linen protected by an outer wrapping of rubberized canvas, the outer surface of the canvas gummed with dried silt at the seams but sealed. A canvas bag of small weight and faint metallic rattle, the contents shifting when she lifted. A sealed tin letter box, of the type used by the Army to protect correspondence in the field, its lid soldered shut. She set them on the dry clay beside the chest in the order she had removed them, and looked at them for a moment before she began. She took the field book first, as she always took field books first, because they contained the data that everything else was built from. It was the record of a survey conducted in April and May of 1884, in the names of 2 surveyors, and across 11 parcels of bottomland along the Cimarron River in what was then the unorganized territory. She read the opening pages carefully, noting the instrument calibrations, the datum used, the control monuments referenced. The work was precise. The penmanship was that of someone who had been trained in the formal methods, even spacing, consistent abbreviations, corrections, crossed with a single line rather than obscured. A professional's field notes, written by someone who understood that the record was the work. What the record showed, in columns of figures and marginal notes written in that careful hand, was the presence of a placer bench of exceptional quality running beneath the flood zone of the Cimarron. Between two monument points she was able to identify from the survey's own descriptions. Transit walked the day before. The bench was exposed at low water and producing recoverable color at a density the note-taker had calculated at $4 to $7 per cubic yard of material. He had performed this calculation at 3 sampling points across the bench's extent and had noted that the highest concentration fell in the central reach between the monument at the north end of Parcel 6 and the monument at the south end of Parcel 8. Parcel 7 occupied that central reach. The survey had been commissioned, the fieldbook's front matter stated, by the Cimarron Basin Development Association, Wichita, Kansas, in the name of its principal agent, whose name was given as Ezra Holt. She understood then why the flooded claim had never been purchased. Parcel 7, the lowest of the 11 along the bench, sat directly above the deposit's highest concentration point, the place where the surveyor's calculations showed the richest material accumulating in the river's natural settling geometry. The association had not flooded Parcel 7. The river had done that on its own in 1886, 2 years after the survey. But when the flood came, Ezra Holt had recognized what it offered, a way to let the most valuable parcel lapse, without explaining why it was more valuable than the rest of the land he had already bought, at prices that would have looked very different to their sellers, had those sellers known what the 1884 survey contained. The linen cartographic roll was the survey's plat, drafted at instrument quality, every measurement recorded and witness marked, a document that would stand up to comparison with any government land office standard she was aware of. The canvas bag contained 37 sample discs of alluvial clay, each labeled with its collection point, its depth, and an assay figure, the samples still firm inside their cloth wrappings. The tin letterbox held a single letter on association letterhead, addressed to Holt and signed by the association's secretary, acknowledging receipt of the survey report and authorizing Holt to proceed with the acquisition program while the survey results remained, in the secretary's phrase, within the circle of those who need to act upon them. Vera sat for a long time with the letter in her hands. There was something a woman who read survey records learned about the gap between what a document said and what it meant to say. The letter did not use the word suppress. It did not use the word conceal. It used the phrase within the circle of those who need to act upon them, which meant the same thing in a way that would be much harder to argue before a court, but not impossible, if the survey itself was in the hands of the Territorial Land Office and the Territorial Court had an interest in reading it clearly. She thought again about who had placed the chest here. The question stayed with her. She turned it over in the same methodical way she worked a difficult survey calculation, looking at it from each side and not hurrying toward an answer. The field book named both surveyors. The second surveyor's name was written smaller than the first, in a different ink as if added later, and it appeared only in the front matter and not in the body of the daily field notes, which were written entirely in the first surveyor's hand. A two-man survey with one man's handwriting throughout meant one man had done the recording and perhaps the thinking. She could not know from the record alone whether the second surveyor had understood what he was part of. What she could know was this: the chest had been placed on Parcel 7, not on any of the other 10. It had been placed on the one parcel the association did not own. Sealed in a box, the association had no way to claim a reason to search. A surveyor who understood land titles would have understood why Parcel 7 was the correct hiding place. A surveyor who had helped establish the value of a bench and had then watched that value used to underpay 11 sellers was a man with a grievance and no legal remedy in a territory that in 1884 had no court to hear him. He had done the only thing available to him. He had created a record that would outlast the grievance and placed it where it might eventually come to the right hands. She decided she would find out what she could about the first surveyor. After the more pressing work was done, the sellers of parcels 1 through 6 and 8 through 11 had sold their land without knowing the 1884 survey existed. They had sold to a company whose agent had commissioned a study showing their land was worth multiples of what they received, and had then used the survey's own confidentiality to acquire at a price that assumed ignorance. In Oklahoma Territory, where land fraud had been a growth industry since the run of 1889, the territorial court had been seeing exactly this kind of case and had been finding, with some regularity, that willful withholding of material survey data during a land transaction constituted a form of fraudulent inducement. She did not know the law with precision. She knew enough of it to know she needed someone who did. She also understood, with the same clarity she brought to reading a plat, that the documents she held were evidence only as long as they arrived at the correct office, in the hands of someone with a legitimate interest in presenting them. She was that person. She had purchased the land that had yielded the chest. She had opened it with a key she had lawfully inherited. The chain of possession was intact and clean, which was exactly the kind of chain that could not be argued away. She spent the rest of that day verifying the survey's monument points against the original government land office marks still present in the benchland, walking the transit between each one, checking the association surveyor's work against the established control network with her own instrument and her own calculation. The numbers matched, measurement by measurement, bearing by bearing, precisely within the tolerances of two instruments working independently on the same ground. That matching was the worst possible result for the association. An accurate suppressed survey is more damning than an inaccurate one, because the accuracy demonstrates that its commissioners knew exactly what they had and chose, with full understanding, to keep it from the people it concerned. She recorded her verification measurements in her field notebook, column by column, and noted the date and her instrument's serial number beside them. In the evening she built a small fire, not for warmth in August, but for the light, and sat beside it going through the copied figures, while the river made its small evening sounds. She was not yet thinking about what her own parcel was worth, the bench beneath her feet and the accumulations the drought had stripped down to. That was a different question, and a later one. The first question was what the men and women who had sold their land to Ezra Holt's company were owed, and what the Territorial Land Office could do about it if the evidence arrived, correctly packaged. She knew one person who might help her understand how to package it. Her name was Ruth Archer, and she ran the General Land Office in Guthrie, which had been the territorial capital since April, and which had been processing fraud complaints since the moment the territory had organized itself. Vera had met her once, briefly, during a survey engagement the previous year. Ruth Archer had struck her as a woman who read a survey plat, the way Vera read one, with the full attention of someone who understood that the numbers meant something beyond themselves. She arrived in Guthrie 7 days later, 3 by wagon and 4 on foot, the chest strapped to the wagon bed and covered with canvas against the road dust. She had brought the chest itself, and she had brought her field notebook with its copied figures, and she had brought the original contents of the chest in her satchel, each document wrapped in fresh oilcloth and tied with string, packed in the order she had found them. She had not brought Ezra Holt's awareness of any of it. She had made no inquiries about the association's current operations or location that might have made their way back to Woodward. She had moved quietly, and she had moved fast. Guthrie, in September of 1889, was a city that had existed for 5 months, its streets laid out on the prairie with the geometric confidence of a government plat, and the hastily nailed reality of 10,000 people who had arrived in a single day in April and needed somewhere to put their furniture. The Territorial Land Office occupied a frame building on Harrison Avenue, its exterior still unpainted, its interior organized with the thorough efficiency of a woman who had been waiting for a real office and intended to make full use of it the moment she had one. Ruth Archer was a compact woman of perhaps 50 with gray, threaded through dark hair and ink on her right index finger, and the manner of someone who had spent decades being handed fraudulent paper and had developed a finely calibrated nose for its composition. She had come from the Kansas Land Office, where she had spent 17 years, and before that from the Missouri Recorder's Office, where she had learned the conveyance system from a clerk who had taught her that the important information in a deed was never the property described, but the consideration paid and the name of the grantee. She had applied these principles to 17 years of Kansas land transactions and had found them reliable. She received Vera in the back room of the land office, which was also where she worked, the front room being given over to the clerks who processed the daily filings. She looked at Vera when she came in, and then looked at the satchel she was carrying, which was heavy enough to require 2 hands. "Set it on the table," she said. Vera set the contents of the chest on the office table in sequence, explaining each document's provenance and the method by which she had come to possess the claim that had yielded them. Ruth Archer did not interrupt her once. She listened the way she read, with full attention and no expression that might divert a speaker from saying what she had come to say. When Vera finished, Ruth Archer sat for a moment looking at the 1884 survey plat, her index finger tracing one of the measurement lines without touching the surface of the linen. "You surveyed the monuments yourself," she said. "Yes," Vera said, "and your own figures match, within the instrument's tolerance." Ruth Archer sat back and looked at the letter on association letterhead, then at the canvas bag of sample discs, then at the field book. She was doing the same thing Vera had done on the flood bench, which was reading the full set of things before saying anything about any of them. "Then what you have," she said at last, "is an executed survey commissioned by the party who withheld it, in the custody of a third party who acquired the land legally, and has no reason to suppress it. That is about as clean a piece of evidence as this office has seen since it opened." She paused. "The sellers will need to be found and notified. Some of them sold in 1882. 7 years is a long time. I have their names from the conveyance ledgers," Vera said. She placed her field notebook on the table, opened to the page where she had copied the grantor names and their recorded consideration amounts from the Woodward County deeds. 11 sellers, 10 parcels, the recorded price, beside each name in her own hand, the undervaluation visible in the numbers, without requiring further explanation. Ruth Archer looked at the page for a moment, then at Vera, and then she pulled the notebook toward her and reached for a fresh sheet of paper. She was a woman who, when shown the work, got straight to the next piece of it. What followed occupied the better part of 2 years in the territorial court system, and Vera was present for very little of it directly. Ruth Archer's office filed a complaint with the Territorial Attorney's Office in October 1889 attaching the survey, the plat, the assay samples, the letter on association letterhead, and Vera's own field notebook showing the verified monument checks. The complaint named Ezra Holt by name and the Cimarron Basin Development Association by its corporate form, and it described the 1884 survey with enough precision that any reader who looked at the attached documents could follow the argument without assistance. Ezra Holt, when served with notice of the proceedings in Woodward, retained counsel in Wichita. The counsel's initial response characterized the complaint as a misunderstanding of ordinary commercial practice and described the 1884 survey as a proprietary business document whose non-disclosure was a matter of standard discretion, no different from any company's decision about which of its internal studies to share with a counterparty in a negotiation. The argument was made in confident, formal language. It was not a weak argument. It was the argument a man makes when he has used the same reasoning for years, and no one has had the means to contest it. The territorial court considered the complaint for 3 months, then in a ruling handed down in the spring of 1890, disagreed with the council's characterization in terms that left little room for appeal. The court found that the 1884 survey had been commissioned specifically to establish values material to the purchase transactions that followed, that its results were known to the commissioning party at the time of those transactions, and that its deliberate exclusion from the negotiations constituted a fraudulent withholding of material fact under the territory's land fraud statutes, then in effect. The court further noted in a passage that Vera would later copy into the margin of her field notebook that the willingness of a party to suppress its own accurate evidence in order to transact at a lower price could not be dressed as commercial discretion. Since discretion implied a legitimate choice, and suppression of material value was not a legitimate choice available to a principal in a land transaction. The association was ordered to make restitution to the sellers of parcels 1 through 6 and 8 through 11 at the difference between what they had received and what the survey's data indicated the land was worth at the time of sale. The restitution was to be calculated parcel by parcel, using the association's own survey figures and the assay samples from the chest as the measure of value. The very documents that had been sealed away now serving as the instrument of the accounting. Holt's counsel argued through the summer of 1890 that the association's assets were insufficient to meet the restitution order. The territorial court, after examining the association's books, found that the assets were sufficient, that certain entries in the books had been arranged to suggest a shortfall that the actual accounts did not support, and that the association would meet the order in full, with interest at the statutory rate from the date of each original transaction. The sellers, or in 3 cases their heirs, received the difference in cash over the course of 1890 and into early 1891. 2 of the sellers were still farming land adjacent to the parcels they had sold. One was a widow living with her daughter in a house on the south edge of Woodward. 3 had moved on to other parts of the territory in the years between. Ruth Archer's office found them all, because Ruth Archer's office knew how to use a land record to find a person when it needed to. Vera was not a party to the restitution proceedings. She had provided the evidence and she had no further role in the distribution, which was, as she had understood it should be from the beginning. The value in the chest had not been hers to begin with. It had belonged to the seller, stored away in the wrong form in the wrong place, waiting for the mechanism that would release it back to them. She had opened the lock. The rest had followed from that, the way a survey's truth follows from its measurements, 1 step at a time, in the right order, and not by any means other than the work itself. The work that remained was her own. In the spring of 1890, while the territorial court proceedings moved through their deliberate course, she filed her own claim with the Territorial Land Office for the placer bench beneath Parcel 7. The claim was based on the 1884 survey's measurements, which were now public record as exhibits in the court filing, and on her own survey, which confirmed them in every particular. She had no capital to work the bench herself, and she had understood this from the beginning. What she had was clear title to the land, a documented and instrument-verified placer deposit, and the ability to read a contract without requiring anyone to explain its meaning to her. She also had, by this point, a second piece of information about the chest and its origins. She had written to the Survey Registration Office in Dodge City, which had maintained records for the unorganized territory before Oklahoma's organization, and had asked about the first surveyor named in the 1884 field book's front matter. The registration office wrote back in March of 1890. The surveyor had registered his credentials in Kansas in 1879 and had worked throughout the territory until 1887, when his registration had lapsed without renewal. The office had no forwarding address. It had, however, a note in the margin of his file, placed there by a registrar in 1887, indicating that the lapse had coincided with the surveyor's departure for the Indian Territory under circumstances the note did not elaborate upon. She read the letter twice, then set it in her field notebook beside the page where she had copied the first surveyor's name from the field book's front matter. She did not know the whole of what had happened to him. She knew that a man who had sealed evidence in a strongbox and placed it on a flooded claim in a territory with no court to hear him had eventually left the territory, which was what a man did when the only course left to him was patience of a kind that outlasted his own presence. He had done his part. The rest had required the drought and the auction, and a woman with a transit and a key she had been told to keep. She thought briefly that she might try to find him. Then she decided that if he had wanted to be found, he would have left his name somewhere more accessible than the front matter of a field book, sealed inside an iron chest beneath a flood. She let the thought settle and did not pursue it further. A mining concern from Denver made the first offer in June. She read their proposal carefully, working through its 12 pages with the same methodical attention she gave a conveyance ledger, and declined it in writing, noting 3 provisions she considered unacceptable. The first concerned a royalty rate, which was below what the 1884 assay figures suggested the deposit could support. The second concerned the right of inspection, which the contract proposed to limit in ways she would not accept. The third concerned what happened to her claim if the concern identified an adjacent bench during its operations and determined that the bench extended beyond Parcel 7's boundary. The draft proposed to assign the adjacent claim to the concern, which was the same logic the association had used on the sellers of parcels 1 through 10. She declined to participate in that logic, regardless of which side of the ledger she was on. She noted all 3 in writing and returned the document. The concern's second offer addressed the royalty rate and the inspection right. She declined again, noting the third provision remained unchanged. Their third offer addressed it, assigning her the right of first survey on any adjacent bench identified in the concern's operations. She accepted. The terms gave her a royalty on production, the right of inspection twice yearly, and the adjacent bench provision. It was not a fortune. It was an income, reliable and documented and derived from the labor of knowing what she was looking at when she stood on a piece of ground. Her father had told her once, on a cold morning in the Kansas Panhandle, while they waited for the frost to leave the instrument, that a survey was always an active witness. You were present to what the land was, not what someone else said it was, and the measurement was your testimony. She had carried that idea for 5 years now, through 4 territories and 1 courthouse and 1 riverbank in a drought summer, and she had found no reason to set it down. She built a house on the bench in 1891, a small frame structure set back from the floodline by the margin she calculated from the 1884 high water records in her father's plat maps. She set the transit on its tripod in the front room because there was nowhere else to put it, and because she had been walking too long to stop caring where it was. The chest she had brought from the Cimarron bench she set beside the front door, its hasp open and its interior empty. She used it to hold her field notebooks, adding 1 each season as the work accumulated. She had not told anyone the land was going to be worth anything. She had not needed to. The river had already told her. She had only been in a position to listen. There is something that happens to a woman who knows how to read the ground. The thing the world dismisses has a way of recognizing her, of giving itself back when everyone else has already walked away. What she carried out of the Cimarron bottomland in the late summer of 1889, it was the proof that the measurement had been made, that someone had witnessed the land for what it was, and that the witness had been sealed away by men who understood its value and meant to keep that understanding private. She opened the lock they had not known existed. She delivered the testimony to the court that could act on it. And she built her house above the floodline and lived in it, season after season, with the transit in the front room and the chest by the door, adding notebooks. What remains when the river falls and leaves something on the cracked clay of a flood bench is not always what you expected. It is sometimes the evidence that the ground was always worth more than you were told. The woman who bought that ground for $1 and could read what the evidence said is not a figure the history books made room for. History tends to record what the companies did with the land. It tends to forget who opened the chest. She opened the chest. The rest followed from that. If this story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments about the last thing you knew, the value of that no one else could see. And if you want another story about a woman who found something the world had already given up on, there is one waiting for you.